Everybody, welcome to the Jim Masters Show. We are so happy to have you here, and we're going to be celebrating the career of somebody very special that you have known and loved on your television and stage and film for many, many years. Unfortunately, no longer with us, but he left us a legacy of incredible, beautiful work. We're talking about Burt Reynolds, but there's somebody very special who is a renowned and legendary screenwriter, motion picture director, and so much more, who worked on this epic documentary, which was The Last Interview with Burt Reynolds, an extraordinary documentary, so well received, so beloved, and so many people still talking about it. And we have an opportunity here to welcome the guy that put it all together with an amazing team, including Quentin Tarantino was a part of it, and so much more as they celebrated Burt in what turned out to be The Last Interview. And of course, we know that Burt Reynolds was one of those people that just left us with a legacy of smiles, of incredible work. The Last Interview is uncut, unscripted, uncensored, and with exclusive Q&As with Academy Award winner Quentin Tarantino and close associates, revealing that final act of his life and reveling in it, of course, as well. In his own words, Burt explains himself, his career, success, and secret passions, and advice for others. But it wasn't something that necessarily was, designed to be that way. It sort of turned out that way. Burt had passed away. And of course, Burt Reynolds, again, as I said, left us with a legacy of so many shows and movies and laughs. Of course, his time with Sally Field and Dinah Shore is legendary as well, and Lonnie Anderson. And of course, the moments on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson were always epic. You remember he had his own talk show as well, The Late Show. That was a great one. You can see clips, I think, on YouTube. Of course, Hawk was another one. Remember Evening Shade and Dan August. And of course, Smokey and the Bandit, that wonderful series, Jackie Gleason, Sally Field, so much more. And as I mentioned, Lonnie Anderson too, as well. Burt Reynolds, again, a true icon and a beloved figure in American film and television and stage. Famous, of course, for so many great performances in Gunsmoke, Hawk, Dan August, leading roles in films such as Navajo Joe, 100 Rifles, and of course, Deliverance. He played leading roles in a number of subsequent financial successes too, like White Lightning, The Longest Yard, Smokey and the Bandit, and of course, Semi-Tough, The End, Hooper, Starting Over, Smokey and the Bandit 2, The Cannonball Run, Sharky's Machine, The Best Little Whorehouse in Texas, Cannonball Run. When you look at it, it's amazing. You sort of refresh your memory of all the amazing things he was a part of. And also several he directed as well. He was nominated twice for Golden Globe Awards for Best Actor in the Motion Picture, Musical, or Comedy, and so much more. He was also voted the world's #1 movie actor from 78 to 82 in the annual Top 10 Money-Making Stars poll, a record that he shares with Bing Crosby as well. Again, truly an iconic figure, and we are here to celebrate him, but also celebrate the career of somebody who has been in the industry for a long time. And I'm talking about Rick Pamplin as a screenwriter, motion picture director, but also a CBS News journalist. He grew up in Michigan. He's going to talk about that as well. So join us as we welcome, coming to us from beautiful, sunny Florida, screenwriter and motion picture director, the extraordinary award-winning Rick Pamplin, joining us here on the Jim Masters Show. Rick, welcome to the show, my friend. It's an honor and a pleasure to have you here.
I feel the same way. And before we get started, and by the way, great summary of Bert's life. Thank you very much. Glad to be here. End of the show. No, you did a great job. But I just want to say, Jim, and I mean this sincerely with all my heart, what you're doing on your show, YouTube, all the stuff you're doing to keep memories alive, to promote great stories, great artists. I'm a huge fan. I have a great respect for you. I mean, you're an Irish guy. You want to be positive. You try to promote positive things, and you love show business. And I don't know if I'm describing you or me or both of us,
Right.
but I want to say it's a real honor. I love your show. And I love what you're doing. And I also, and I mentioned to you this before we went on the air, you sound a lot like Regis Philbin. And I did Regis the show, AM Los Angeles, and I've also ran into Regis a few times socially, and he was a great guy, tremendous talent, and I'm kind of dating myself, but one of the things you do so well on your show is you pay tribute to some of the great legends, and I would love to see people in the comments if they agree with me, because I will shut my eyes and listen to some of your interviews, and you are like Regis Philbin incarnate. I mean, it's like you're Regis, and which is not a bad thing. So it's a big compliment. But I do want to compliment you and your work and encourage you and let you know how much many of us, including my great friend Scott DuPont, who has produced my last 3 movies, who set us up, people who have great respect for you, your talent, and this show. And so to all of you listening, we appreciate your support, and we very much appreciate the opportunity to be here today to talk about the great Burt Reynolds, my lifelong obsession with working with Burt, and how I luckily got there shortly before, unfortunately, he passed away at 82, far too young. But Burt has given me one of the greatest blessings of my life. I had lunch with one of his managers recently, and they were talking about the film, the Burt Reynolds' last interview. And he said, Rick, Burt, worked hard. He physically did stunts. He hurt himself. He was so passionate about his work. And he said, I've heard from all of his friends and family and people. And I said, I do too. I said, I was on LinkedIn, and I was getting over 100 people a day that were watching the film and writing me about Burt. And in the beginning, I tried to answer them. I just don't have enough time. And I don't, I'd rather do the podcast like yours and reach thousands of people. But I had to get off LinkedIn because the Burt film, I heard from people all over the world who were so moved and touched by my film about Burt. And I wanted to give, answers and respond to those people. But I hear from people almost every day, Jim, on Twitter, which is now X, or, in my everyday life. People endlessly want to talk about Burt. They want to know about how we made the movie, what Burt was really like, why I did the movie. And it's amazing how many people he touched in so many different ways, not only as an actor, but as you know, the movie is the truth about Burt Reynolds' private life, not the romances and the gossip, but about who was Burt Reynolds, who was he really. And I spent over a year trying to get the people, including Quentin Tarantino, to talk about Burt. And Quentin was amazing and very supportive of the film, and contributed really the cherry on top to the Burt story of their friendship that developed over the years, and how Burt came to get cast in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. And Burt went out to Hollywood and did the table read, with Leonardo DiCaprio and Brad Pitt and, Al Pacino, and that whole experience. And it was funny because I had done an interview for another movie, and I finally had got Burt. And I had lifelong obsession, growing up in Michigan, going out to Hollywood. I'd actually met Burt. Burt actually came up to me on one of my birthdays at a restaurant where an executive producer had taken me, and the owner of the restaurant in Jupiter, Florida, whose name was Jim, was like, Burt would eat dinner there every night. And on my birthday, he put me at a table on the patio overlooking the lighthouse in the Intercoastal next to Burt. And Burt came over and wished me happy birthday. So Burt was always in my life. And I went to a movie set of his in Las Vegas at a very interesting night to meet him. But I had pursued Burt my whole life. So we were only going to do 10 minutes. And I'm sure people do this to you, Jim, where the powers that be, well, you can have Burt for 10 minutes and that's it, blah, 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 blah. And I was making a film which was called Movie Money Confidential. Here's a mini version of the poster, and there's Bert down there in the bottom and Salma Hayek and whatnot. And we had gotten the rights to a book that helped independent filmmakers write business plans and raise money for film. So since I was in Palm Beach and Bert was in Palm Beach and I was always trying to work with Bert, we had contacted Bert and he was very ill and he couldn't do it. And the shoot was 5 weeks long. So on the Monday of the last week, we got a call and they said, Bert will talk to you for 10 minutes, but it has to be 7 o'clock Friday at his acting school. And we said, we'll take whatever we can get. So that interview ended up being an hour and a half. And the first thing, we said to Bert, this is a movie, this is a documentary about raising money for independent films. And Bert goes, I don't know a damn thing about it. We're like, what? Bert said, I'm not interested. I couldn't do it, And so I'm sitting there and I thought, I remembered in the one of my favorite books as a kid was Catcher in the Rye. And I remember when Holden Caulfield was saying that when they would get up and tell book reports in English class, like the student would get up and start talking about his uncle, and it was more interesting than the book report, and the teacher would get mad at him and yell at him. And I thought, I've spent my entire adult life chasing Burt Reynolds. I'm finally sitting here with him. I've got 3 cameras, and we'll just talk about whatever. So Bert and I talked about his dad. We talked about his career. We talked about the movie business. We talked about anything that came. I had no notes. I had done no preparation because I felt like I knew Bert, and I don't like to do notes and I don't like to do questions and all that. And I kept looking at my watch, 15 minutes, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour. And out of the corner of my eye and my peripheral vision, I could see his people going, it's done. Shut up. The interview. And I just kept going and Bert kept going. And it turned out to be one of the greatest experiences of my life. I think we actually did an hour and 30 minutes of what was supposed to be a 10-minute interview. And in the end, there's a lot more I can tell you, but at the end, so his manager, Todd, who lived with him and sort of managed him, and Bert was having problems walking at the time and getting around. And so Todd was his sort of assistant when he'd go on location, shoot a movie. Todd was there at the table read with Quentin Tarantino and Brad Pitt and Leonardo DiCaprio. So he'd tell me all these stories. And he said to me, after Bert passed away, we had lunch, and I think we both cried for about 3 hours. And I tried to get Todd's in the movie, and I tried to get him, and he just said, I can't ever talk about Bert on camera, and I can't do it. And People magazine had offered him $50,000 to do an interview, and then a tabloid had offered $100,000, and he just said, I can't do it. I just can't do it. And so he said to me something that I think, Jim, you will really relate to, and maybe your audience. But he said that Bert was different in this interview with me. And Bert wore a little gold cross on his blue sweater, on his baby blue sweater. And unbeknownst to me, on his 82nd birthday, which was just before we did the interview, Bert had come out for Jesus and said that he was announcing his faith in Jesus and that he had found his religion. And he wore this little cross in the interview. And we talk in the film about God and different things. And I didn't know any of this. I had no preparation. And I thought I was going to talk to him for 10 minutes about film financing. And so Bert kind of put down the guard. And, he's funny and he's Burt Reynolds, but he really opened up in a way. I watched every interview I could ever find with Burt Reynolds, and I've never seen him be like this. So Todd's driving him back to his house in Jupiter, and he says, what did you think of this interview? And Bert said, well, what did you think of it? And Todd said, well, I've never seen you do an interview like this. And Bert said, I know. He said, but I felt good with it. I liked it. And later, and this is one of the greatest things that's ever happened to me in my life, Bert said, he was talking because Bert was calling. He wanted to see the film, the other film I was making. And he had to go out to LA to do the Quentin Tarantino thing. So we were trying to schedule something. So Bert gave me 2 dates, a Saturday and a Sunday, that he was going to be available if I could screen a rough cut for him. He wanted to see the film because he was really anxious to see, how he came across in this different type of interview, which is unlike any interview Bert had ever done. And so he went out to LA and came back, and then he was reading sides and scenes with Todd at his house, and he didn't feel well, and he went in the bathroom and had a heart attack and yelled for Todd and passed away. And it was 6 days before my screening, and Bert never got to see the film. So Todd told me one time, he said Bert said that there were Bert did not like interviews, did not like documentaries, wasn't interested in any of that, and really didn't like the press, because most of what the press had reported or written about him wasn't true. And even in my interview, he talks about he's really hurt and disturbed by the lies and the things that the gossip people in the press are writing about him. And so Todd says, he said, Bert said there were 3 great interviews that he did in his life: Johnny Carson, Dinah Shore, and yours. And Jim, I tell you, that's a moment you live for. When you get that kind of respect from Bert, who I spent my whole life, going after. So to be able to share this, and by the way, I sat on this for about 2 years. Every tabloid show called us. We had an offer one time, Scott and I, because Scott was a producer in the film, for $100,000 cash if we would just give them the outtakes of because we ended up in our other movie Money Confidential, using about 8 minutes of Bert, not very much, because it wasn't relevant to the movie. So I had this like hour and 15 minutes of Bert, and they wanted, we got offers to do interviews for money. And I said, no, that's disrespectful. So we gave a percentage of the profits of that film to the Burt Reynolds Scholarship, which is a thing here in Florida, which is for young filmmakers. Every year through the Palm Beach County Film and TV Commission, they do this thing called the Student Showcase of Films. So we donated, a percent, and we've sent checks to them, and they're very grateful, and they're terrific. And they're still every year, just a couple of weeks ago, they gave out the Burt Reynolds Scholarship, and we're proud to be contributors. So everybody tried to get the footage. And then one day, my editor called me, and he was cutting a trailer or doing something on the other film. And he said, have you looked at the Burt Reynolds footage? I said, no, you have it. I don't have it. He said, I went in to do a cut, and I watched 5 minutes of Bert, and I couldn't stop watching it for an hour and a half. He said, we have to do something with this. And I said, well, could you just send me a time code, rough cut, uncorrected? Send it to me. I'll look at it. So I watched it, and I thought, oh my gosh, this is the Burt Reynolds that the public just doesn't know what this guy was about, which was teaching, community, loving his students, love of craft, all of the things that made Bert tick, and the end of his life, and why he moved to Florida from Hollywood, what he was doing in Florida, his generosity, his dinner theater, which he started and he lost, and all of that stuff. And so I watched it, and I got a call one day from a distributor of the other film. We're doing a DVD. Is there any outtakes or anything that you can give us of Bert? I said, well, I'll give you another movie. I'll give you a movie of Bert. I'll do the real Burt Reynolds story. And they were very interested. I think it took us 3 days to raise the money and sign a distribution contract. And so then they said, oh, you're going to do Smoking the Bandit and all this. No. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in Burt Reynolds' life in Florida, the man, what he was, not the tabloid version, not the gossip version, all of that. And then I went to everybody in the film, and everybody said no. And it took me about a year, Jim, to get those people to agree to trust me to talk to me about Bert. And they said, well, how much are you going to pay? And I said, nothing. And they said, fine. And then I went to the Maltz Theater, which was now the version of what was the Burt Reynolds Dinner Theater. And I said, the guy running it is this amazingly talented guy who was a waiter, at the Burt Reynolds Theater when he was a teenager. And today he runs this beautiful complex, the Maltz Theater. And they had just done during the pandemic a $40 million renovation, and nobody had filmed in it. And, I kept calling and trying to meet with him. And finally, I sent Burt Reynolds' manager and my wife, Maggie, who was the other producer, to go crash this guy's office, which they did. And they pitched him the movie, and they said, we want you to be in it. We want you to talk about, when you were a waiter, what Bert was like in the theater and, what happened. And so they let us film in this $40 million renovated theater in Jupiter, Florida at the Maltz Theater for free. So the film came together very quickly, and I got the 2 film commissioners to interview. And then we were trying to get Brad Pitt, because it turns out Brad Pitt, when he grew up in Missouri, was like the biggest Burt Reynolds fan. And Todd told me when they went out to Hollywood and they did the read for Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, that Brad Pitt was standing in the parking lot waiting to greet Burt. And he would help Burt out of the car, and he would help Burt walk into the theater where they were doing the reading. And I said, well, wow, I'd really like to talk to Brad about Burt, and the whole thing. So Brad was doing a couple of promotion things for movies, and we spent about a year trying. We looked like we was going to do it, and then we went after Quentin Tarantino, and I didn't know Quentin, and I'm not a big guy on violence, and I have respect for Quentin and what he's accomplished. He's an amazing writer and filmmaker, no question about it. But I was kind of like, well, I don't know if we want to. So Scott calls me up and he goes, Quentin wants to do the movie. And I was like, okay. So we do the interview, and Quentin Tarantino just blew my mind. He told the most amazing Burt story. He was the most wonderful, open guy. And I've had several people, and Jim, I probably shouldn't say that, but say what I'm going to say, but I like your show, so I'm going to give you kind of a scoop here. Several people have said to me, and I hope this doesn't offend Quentin because I think we're friends now. Several people have said to me, I wasn't necessarily a big Quentin Tarantino fan, but I saw him in your Burt Reynolds movie, and what a great guy he is. Because I also get a Quentin Tarantino that you don't see everywhere else. And he talks about his relationship with Burt and how they kind of danced around each other. And then they became, and I didn't know this, it's in the film, that what close friends they became at the end of Burt's life. And they became phone buddies. And Quentin just does a tremendous job, and great respect to Burt. He also sort of frames what Burt meant to the industry. And you did that great introduction. But Burt was the #1 box office star, and the last one to be for consecutive 10 years, the #1 box office star. And I did some research. A lot of people in the movie industry judge you by how many tickets you sell, what they call butts in the seat for a movie. Burt Reynolds only is second to the actors that have sold the most tickets in movie theaters to see their movies. #1 is John Wayne. #2 is Burt Reynolds, and #3 is Tom Cruise. So it's a very elite group of people. But Burt is the only star that was ever the #1 box office star for 10 years in a row. And what was amazing about Burt would do dramatic, great films like Deliverance, Smokey and the Bandit, which is a great good old boy comedy. He would do light comedy. He would do all kinds of different genres. And he could do a comedy. He could do an action picture. He could do a drama. And he never really got, I think, the respect that he deserved. I think he's one of the greatest actors ever. And then, of course, as you mentioned in the opening, the Johnny Carson show, all of the stuff that he did as a personality was unbelievable. And I mean, he really made an imprint on American culture. And, the saying was that, women wanted to be with him and men wanted to be him, which they also used to say about Cary Grant. But he had a charisma and he had something that I haven't seen in anybody since he passed. So he gave me this enormous gift. And we gave, again, Scott DuPont and Maggie and I, the producers and I, have donated some of the profits of the new film, the Burt Reynolds, The Last Interview, to the Burt Reynolds Scholarship, that to keep his memory going and to keep helping young kids, which he really cared about. So I don't mean to filibuster. I should let you get in here. I'm sorry, Jim, but I could talk about Burt forever. I love him so much. And he's
No, it's a wonderful, wonderful tribute to him as we're celebrating him. Of course, Deliverance was another one of those amazing movies. His legacy extraordinary and intact. I agree with what you said. In recent, I'd say the last 2 to 3 years, I've been digging deep into Burt Reynolds as well and looking at some of the more obscure conversations, interviews, which, like you said, were not always something that was available because he didn't do lots of them. But he had a quick wit, an incredible timing that was extraordinary. And there are clips on the internet of the Late Show, the Burt Reynolds Late Show that he did, where he was doing comedy, he was doing a little drama, he was interviewing people. It was a late night talk show even before they became huge. And it was a great look at him doing something. It didn't last forever, but to see him in a role that way with the comedic timing, like you saw with Smoking the Bandit and a lot of other things that we saw him in, he was definitely underrated for his fabulous charm, charisma, and the quick wit that he had.
Yeah, he has some of that in our movie. He's pretty funny at times. But it's interesting. He arrived at his school. I'll tell you this story. So they told us, "Oh, you can get in at 6:30, and you have to film exactly at 7 o'clock, and 7:10 you're out." So I'm a director. I've been directing. I've been chasing Burt my whole life. So I said to Scott, I said, no, I have to be there at 6 o'clock. And he said, they're not going to let us in. We have to go by their rules. And I said, I've spent my whole life chasing Burt Reynolds. I'm going to film him with 3 cameras, great audio, great lighting. I'm going to respect this man. I need an hour to set up. And if they don't let me in at 6 o'clock, I'm not doing the interview. And, Scott's pulling his hair out and, whatever. And oh my God. Well, they relented and they let us come at 6 o'clock. So we go into this acting school that Burt, this was his little Burt Reynolds film and theatrical, whatever it was, school. And they've got this black banner, looks like a garbage bag, hanging. And then they've got like this kind of ugly theatrical set with some old chairs and stuff. And my wife, Maggie, was an artist before we got married. And she's the production designer of our movie. And I said, I can't shoot Burt on this set. And so she gets a ladder and starts tearing down the banner. So the head of the school comes in and he starts yelling, "What are you doing? That's Burt Reynolds' stage. You can't take Burt Reynolds' stage down." I said, I'm not filming Burt Reynolds on this. And, so my wife finds this beautiful portrait of Burt sitting on a horse with his shirt off. And we put that, and then we find this cardboard cutout from At Long Last Love, the Peter Bogdanovich movie. And I put that in and we arrange it and we find some furniture and we set this thing up. And the guy says, Bert's going to come in. He's going to be furious. He's going to throw you out and that's it. You're done. And I said, well, I'm not going to film him in a bad set. I'm just not going to do it. So Bert comes in and he's in the car and Todd comes in and says, Scott, can you come help Bert? Because Scott knew Bert from some other things earlier. And could you help him? Because he couldn't walk. He really couldn't walk. So Scott comes in on one arm, Todd on another. Bert comes in and Bert stops. And he starts looking around. And he looks at the lighting and the 3 cameras. And he looks at the thing. And he said, oh, so you changed my stage, huh? Who did this? I said, I did. And he said, I kind of like it. I like what you've done with the place. And then he came in and he sat down. And then he said, we had 3 cameras and we had 1 on a glider and 2 on sticks. And he said, where do you want me to look? And I was mic'd up and I was sitting in a chair in this sight line. And I said, right here, Mr. Reynolds. And if you could just talk to me. And he goes, do I have to look at you? And I thought, oh no, where? Oh no, I should have had some pretty actress, and I should have been behind him, like whispering in their ear. Or something. And so he didn't like interviews, he didn't like documentaries, and I was told that if you really want to stay in his good side, Bert is good for about 8 minutes in an interview, and then he loses interest. Now,
And do
again,
not have a cup of water on set, as our friend Mark Summers realized on The Tonight Show with Jay Leno once.
exactly.
Don't have any water on set.
Right, where Bert, I remember that. Bert tossed it on him. It's one of the classics. It was great. So what happened was, we just started talking. And I think Bert, sort of got respect for me. And I certainly knew a lot about Bert. And we talked about show business and, all of these different topics. And his dad, who was a police chief, and he told some great stories. And, he talked about Deliverance and other movies and stuff. And I just thought, this is Burt Reynolds at the end of his life. He should be able to say whatever he wants. So when I got in the editing room, Jim, and I know you'll have experience with this because you've worked in TV as well. I was trained at CBS and everything was 3 minutes and cut, and B-roll and Chiron and blah, 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 and all that. And we got in the editing room and the interview was so powerful. I said, to the editors, no B-roll, no cutaway. We're not going to cut a word. This is what was on Burt Reynolds' mind in his own words, what he cared about, who he was, what he wanted to say, and I'm not going to cut it. And we're not going to cut away. We're not going to edit this thing. We're going to let Bert talk. And they're like, you can't do that. And one of the editors came to me and said, you don't understand. The kids today, you got to cut away every 8 seconds. You got to have constant, distraction. They won't. And I said, I'm not making this for teenagers. I'm making this for people that love Burt Reynolds. And today you're putting up, we've got 100% rating on Rotten Tomatoes with both the audience and the critics. People have called it a cinematic masterpiece of Jim, whatever, because I gave Burt the respect he deserved. And if you're a Burt Reynolds fan, I think you're entitled to hear what was on his mind at the end of his life, what he wanted to say. And I know you have this list of rules, which are great, and, be on time and, respect people and all this kind of great stuff. And obviously you were raised well and, you're a gentleman. And I didn't want to interrupt Bert. I wanted to let Bert express himself. And I find it to be fascinating. I'm so gratified. What a gift Bert gave me. I grew up in Michigan, idolizing Bert. I went out to Hollywood. I developed a film, a screenplay with another guy based on the Spade Cooley story, the country western star. When Bert and Sally were together, we got it to Bert's people. We did meeting after meeting after meeting. We did treatments, we did drafts, and we were very close. We were told that getting this film made, and then Bert and Sally broke up. And I'll tell you a funny story. My mother was a retired school teacher. So she had moved to Florida and she used to read the National Enquirer. So she called me up one day and she said, are you still doing that Burt Reynolds, Sally Field movie? I said, yes, we've got it set up with Ray Stark, who's doing Annie. We're over at Columbia Studios. I said, yeah, Mom, I think I'm finally going to get this. They're not going to get that movie made. I said, Mom, what are you talking about? You're living in a trailer in Florida, retired. Well, I got my new National Enquirer today, and Bert and Sally, they're not going to do your movie. And I was like, what? So I called up the studio, and they said, well, you got to come in for a meeting. So we go in for a meeting, and they're like, yeah, they broke up, and we don't think they're going to do the movie. But we have this other great idea. Ray Sharkey wants to do it. And I'm like, I don't think Ray Sharkey's exactly Burt Reynolds. He's a great actor, no longer with us, but he was not Burt Reynolds. And so I spent a great deal of time. I had a literary agent at the time, Mike Hamelberg, who represented me in it. And we got really close. And so when I was in Hollywood, I was always trying to, connect with Bert. So when I moved to Palm Beach, well, Bert lived here. And Bert there was a museum, if you can believe this, about Bert. And I probably went to 10 events there, all with the purposes that I was going to be introduced to Bert officially. Never happened. And then, of course, the birthday. But I'm like you, Jim. I'm a good Irish boy. And Bert was at dinner with a lady friend and had the courtesy to come over and wish me happy birthday. I'm not going to pitch him a business deal. That's just not, it's not proper. And I know people do that, but I like to go through the channels and show respect to people. So anyway, when I earlier in my career, I did a TV show called Gorgeous Ladies of Wrestling, not the Netflix, but the original Gorgeous Ladies of Wrestling. And we were in the Riviera Hotel in Las Vegas. And I was the head writer and the first assistant director on the show. And there was a comedian doing a show called Splash at the Riviera Hotel. His name is Joey Villa. He was a protege of Jerry Lewis. Mm-hmm. And we became friends. And he asked me to write jokes for his show. He would come out for the Splash. The Splash show won like Best Vegas show like 3 years in a row. And he was the MC. He would come out and he would do these jokes. And he had a 450 SL Mercedes convertible. So in the afternoon, we'd go for a drive, buy an ice cream cone, and I'd buy a newspaper, and I would pitch him jokes. And anytime he would laugh, he would throw a $100 bill at me, and I would grab it before it blew out the top of the Mercedes out of the street. So he paid me $100 a joke. So one day, Joey came up to me and he said, "Hey, have you ever met Burt Reynolds?" And I said, "Not really." He said, "I just got cast in a Burt Reynolds movie called Heat that's shooting in Vegas." He said, "Would you like to go with me? I would like to take you as my assistant, and I'll introduce you to Burt." And I was like, "Wow, this is fantastic. I've hit the lottery. I'm going to meet Burt. I'm going with Joey. Joey's my big fan. He's my friend." So I get all excited. We go to the set, and we pull up, and there's like fire engines, and there's police cars, and there's police tape, and there's like hundreds of fans, and there's media, and there's TV cameras. And I thought, wow, this is what a Burt Reynolds set looks like. This is unbelievable. So we park the car and we walk up. And just as we're walking up, there's a guy on a stretcher. And he's going, "Oh!" And he was in real pain. So I said to a police officer while we're waiting to be let in, I said, "Well, who's that?" He goes, "That's the director of the movie." I said, "Well, what happened?" He goes, "Burt Reynolds hit him in the jaw and broke his jaw." I was like, "Oh, well, are they shutting down?" He said, No. Burt's now going to direct the film. Go on in." So I'm like, so we go on the set, and Burt has just broken this guy's jaw and is furious. And
did you up your insurance before you entered?
No, I remember. I'm a big guy. I'm 6'4", and I remember taking baby steps backwards all the way until my back was against the wall behind the Panavision camera. And Joey goes, "Come on, don't you want to meet Burt?" And I said, "Maybe not right now. Maybe a little later. Maybe this isn't the moment to meet Burt Reynolds." And I talked, it's in the movie. We talk about it. And Burt ended up having to, I guess, pay this guy $250,000 because he broke his jaw, because I guess the guy was messing with Burt or something. I don't know what happened. But anyway, so that was my big Vegas moment to meet Burt. So that's kind of how the movie came together. And that's how I got to Burt. And, we got to Quentin and we put this thing together. And it's so ironic. So I'm at lunch with Todd after the film's out. And he goes, "Burt, he really loved his movies." And he goes, "Have you gone to Rotten Tomatoes?" And I said, "No." And he goes, "Well, if you type in Burt Reynolds, your movie comes up with 100% rating. And no other Burt Reynolds movie has ever got 100% rating." And he goes, "Burt would be laughing." He said, "Burt is up there in heaven looking down, laughing his butt off that you actually made the highest rated Burt Reynolds film ever made. So, we try to help the students. We try to donate money to the scholarship, and I try to promote the film. Not so much to promote me, although I think it shows, my skill, but I really want people to get to know Burt, and especially the Burt fans. I've heard from people in China. I've heard, which is not even, I don't think we're supposed to be there, but we're in China. I've heard from people in Sweden. I've heard from people all over the world, Burt Reynolds fans, that love this movie and say that it's their favorite movie, that I really captured Burt. And a lot of women have said to me, I was never like a real, big Burt Reynolds fan, but wow, I really love him in your movie. And I said, well, the Burt Reynolds in my movie is the real Burt Reynolds. If you think you know Burt Reynolds and you haven't seen my movie, you don't know Burt Reynolds. But if you watch my movie, because the people in the movie are the people that were in his life in the last few years of his life, and they are very candid about what he was like and the impact that he put on people. And it's interesting, Jim, and I, again, want to encourage you. I love what you're doing. I love this show. I love all these shows you're doing. The remembrances and the respect you show people, the positive stuff that you put out. I think it's tremendous. I think you're a great talent, and I want you to have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of followers for what you're doing, because I think it's very important. And I think that this film of mine has resonated with people because I don't cut away every 8 seconds. I don't have the tabloid. I don't have the gossip. I'm not interested in that. Somebody did a thread on Reddit attacking the film because I didn't ask Burt questions about his personal bankruptcy or his divorce with Lonnie Anderson. Well, those are things I'm not interested in. We all have ups and downs in our lives. What I was interested in is the good that Burt did with his celebrity, with his money, with his influence to help other people, the unselfish side of Burt, what he gave to the community and what he did for these students, what he did for this dinner theater, what he did for the industry. And he was a very unselfish, very giving guy. And I wanted to give him his due. And what's interesting, Jim, and I'm sure you get offered this as well, people call up all the time and go, if you'll do, a movie about the love life of Burt Reynolds, we'll pay you a huge amount of money, 6 figures. I'm not interested in that. Well, if you'll go do, Burt Reynolds and the tablet, no, I'm not interested in that. I'm not interested in any of that. And I'll tell you what was interesting. When word got out we were making the film, I heard from 100 people, 100 that said, I was Burt Reynolds' best friend. You can't make a movie without putting me in this thing. And I heard from publicists and agents and whatever, but I picked his least famous friends, with the exception of Quentin. I picked because I wanted to tell the story. I wanted to tell the story of how Burt became, Burt Reynolds and what mattered to him. He climbed to the top of the mountain. He made unbelievable amounts of money, unbelievable success. What did it all mean? And Burt said something to me, and he alludes to this a little bit in the film, but he said to me off camera, Jim, he said, if I could do my life over again, I'd be a teacher, not an actor. I get more joy out of teaching and helping young actors than I ever got out of making movies. And if you want to know the essence of Burt Reynolds, that's it. And that's something that he told me. So what happened at the end of the interview, he was in a black chair and he did this to me. He said, you, come here. And I'm like wired up with a lavalier and I'm kind of a klutzy guy and there's cables and lights and cameras. So I get over there and he said, can you lift me up? So I put my arms around Burt and I lifted him out of the chair and he put his arms around me and he put our faces, next to each other. And he said, kid, let's make some movies together. I said, absolutely, Mr. Reynolds. I would love to work with you. I've spent my life trying to get us to do a film. And he said, I can't walk. He said, can you come up with something, a script where I don't have to walk? I said, yes, sir. Yes, sir, I will. And and he said, that's my favorite chair over there. Can you carry me over or help me walk to that chair? And I said, this is Maggie, the producer, my wife, who redecorated your studio. And Maggie came on one side and I came on the other. And Bert sat down. And I had told my crew, no pictures, no autographs, no sight line. Don't, let's respect Mr. Reynolds. And Bert said, don't you want a picture with me? And I said, only if I can get the whole crew in. So that picture at the very end of the movie of the crew with Bert sitting and my wife sitting next to him and us standing behind him, Todd took with his iPhone. And that was how gracious Bert was to everybody. And he was just so respectful. So I started writing. I came up with this great idea, Jim, for a movie. I thought about when I was a kid, Ironside, Raymond Burr and the wheelchair and the whole thing. So I came up with this idea about a cop that gets shot in the back and is in a wheelchair and may never walk again and is trying to figure out who shot him. Mm-hmm. And, Bert is going to play this cop. And Bert's in his apartment and he's got a computer, but he doesn't know how to use it. So he has a nurse that comes, kind of like Rear Window type of thing. And he's got, this computer and he starts learning how to use it. And he starts getting video, cameras, surveillance cameras. And he figures out that the guy that shot him was his partner. They were investigating a serial killer and they were getting close. And Bert was about to figure out that the serial killer was his partner. So his partner shoots him in the back. Now Bert knows it, but he doesn't know who knows it above him or who's in on it. And Bert's trapped in his apartment in a wheelchair with a computer. And then it becomes this sort of Rear Window cat and mouse game. Well, Bert loved it. Fantastic. We'll make it. This is great. We're going to do it. So I was writing the script when I got the call that Bert had passed away. So, I got that close to making another movie, with Bert. But he was such an inspiring figure that even that he couldn't walk, because he had sacrificed his body. He did all of his own stunts. There's that great story. They're doing Deliverance, and the canoe goes off the top of the waterfall, and they put dummies in it. And Bert was very upset with John Borman, the director. And Bert goes over and says, that's ridiculous. That looks like a dummy in a canoe going off. I'll do the stunt. He goes, Bert, if you get hurt, we don't have a picture. You're not insured. We can't do it. Bert says, no, put me in that canoe. I'm coming off the top of the waterfall. I'll risk my life. This is my movie. I want this to be perfect. So they set it up and they rig it and they put Bert in the canoe and Bert comes on the waterfall and the canoe comes down and Bert flies out and lands and then they fish him out of the water and the rapids and the whole thing. So Bert comes over and he's drying off and he says to John Borman, well, what did that look like? And John Borman said, it looked like a dummy going off a canoe off of a waterfall. So Bert would sacrifice his body all the time. He was a stunt man. He talks about it, in the beginning of the movie with this wonderful interview that we found with John Barber, who also is just a wonderful Hollywood guy and was just so gracious. We got this clip where Bert explained how he got in the business. And it's in the beginning of the movie, and it really, I think, explains. But Bert got hired as a stunt man. And then he started doing the acting and, but Bert was also an accomplished director. He did some great little films that I don't think, really got their recognition. But, he did some really terrific, sort of film noir thrillers that as the director. And he said to me, we were talking, and he said, I know you're a director, but he said, I wish you could bring me a script I could direct. And I said, I'll think about that. Let me think about, finding something that you would, because he said, I really like directing. And he said, but nobody will let me direct unless I star in the movie. And he was, here's the interesting thing, Jim.
And he played football in college too.
Well, yeah, he blew out his knee
right
at the Florida State University, FSU. And, he wanted to be a professional football player. But Burt was such a giving person. He went personally bankrupt. He helped people in need. He helped the community and was very generous. He was always helping people. He was always teaching. He was always giving. It's a different Burt Reynolds than you see in a lot of the hit films. A lot of the personalities there. But the point is, and I was starting to say, they say it's a gilded cage and all that. But I've known a lot of famous people, and it is a prison. Once you become famous to the level of Burt Reynolds or a star, and some people handle it really well. I know Clint Eastwood a little. I've had some great experiences with Clint. I love Clint. And he seems to handle it really well. Other people, not so well. Some people totally self-destruct. But you become a prisoner of the character that the media or the public creates of you. And it becomes very hard to ever see who you really are. So what I love about my film is that this is a Burt Reynolds you're not going to see anywhere else. This is a Burt Reynolds that I believe is authentic. I spent over a year researching it. I spent finding the right people, going to the right people. Every single person in this movie, including Burt, said no when we first asked if we could interview him. The film commissioner said no. They said never. Andrew from the Maltz Theater said no. Todd said no, but I persisted. And I think they realized that and they saw my other movie, and they saw my generosity in helping the scholarship fund, for Burt Reynolds. So, this is what I'm always telling you, Jim, in the short time we just met. Stay on the path you're on. You're on a very good path, and your audience will find you. And, I had some successes early in my career. I had a movie that made a lot of money. It was very successful. I worked on some very big movies at a company called Goober Peters at Warner Brothers. And, I've always made a decent living, but, I never really broke through. And it's so ironic that a film about Burt Reynolds, that it's almost like an accidental film. We were supposed to talk about film financing of independent films. And instead we talked about Burt Reynolds and everything that was on his mind shortly before he died. And that became the most successful film that I've ever made. And I have to tell you, it opened doors for me. Our next film was budgeted, I think, 6 times the budget of the Burt Reynolds film. The one I just finished a film, and it opened doors that are unbelievable. And to this day, when I was shooting this movie, I had 110 paid actors on this movie. The first thing that on set, every actor, Rick, I got a question about Burt Reynolds. Oh, I saw the Burt Reynolds film. It's just endless. And I realized my publicist said, no matter what you do for the rest of your life, on your tombstone, it's going to say, Rick Pamplin, the man who directed Burt Reynolds' last movie. He goes, you're going to be remembered for that. And I consider that a blessing. And Todd thinks, and I agree, that Bert's up in heaven looking down, laughing and getting a kick out of this. And if I can let people know what a wonderful person he was, and there aren't a lot of stars like that anymore. And we have to love I love Clint. Clint turns 95 this month, and he's preparing to direct another movie. He just did Juror Number 2, which was a great movie. And when I was on the Warner Brothers lot for 5 years, I used to have an opportunity to talk to Clint. We knew some mutual friends. And Clint's the most gracious, wonderful guy. And probably in my lifetime, of all of the stars, has handled his celebrity the best, because he's a consummate filmmaker and an occasional actor, but unbelievable, 95 years old. I'm working on another project, and my dream cast is Robert Duvall. I've got a part I really want to talk to Robert Duvall about. He's 95. These guys live. So we didn't think, Bert had been sick a lot, and Bert had been hurt a lot. And I just figured I'm going to come up with 2 or 3 films where Bert doesn't have to walk, and I'll make Burt Reynolds movies for the next 10 years. This is my dream. And that was what I was working on when he died. Because we didn't, and I asked Todd and the people around him, he was so excited when he went out to Hollywood to be in the Quentin Tarantino movie and to become friends with Brad Pitt and Leonardo DiCaprio and have this new generation, revere him and accept him and want to work with him. And, nobody thought he was going to pass away, even though he had, some health issues. We figured Burt would be around for quite a long time. And, a lot of these older stars live to their 90. Ernie Borgnine, who I did a picture with, and we were partners for 10 years, called me up. And I think Ernie was 94, maybe 95. And he called me up and he goes, and he always called me kid. And he says, kid, I just did a picture. I said, great, Ernie, that's fantastic. He goes, I rode a horse. I said, wow, like in the Wild Bunch. He goes, they're darn right. He said, but don't tell anybody. I had to climb up a ladder to get on it. But I rode a horse in this movie. He said, I can't wait for you to see it. And Borgnine was like 94 years old. I mean, it's unbelievable. Borgnine made about 250 pictures. And we made a picture together when he was 80 called Hoover, which opened in theaters and was very, a very big deal. And this is the movie I did with Ernie Borgnine, Hoover. And his publicist called me and he said, I'm up at Mr. B's house. He had a big house, big semi-mansion up on the top of Mulholland Drive. And he said, I'm in his den and he's got his TV and his Academy Award is up here for Marty. And he said, I'm sitting in his lazy boy chair. I said, okay, why are you telling me all this? He said he's got one movie poster in his den in his home where he'd sit in his lazy boy and look at his Oscar and watch movies. And the poster is directly behind his chair. And I said, okay. He goes, guess what movie it is? I said, I don't know, The Wild Bunch, Marty. I mean, all these classic movies he made. And he goes, no, it's Hoover. I was like, wow, that's unbelievable. And when the New York Times wrote his obituary in the Hollywood Reporter, they mentioned his favorite films, and my film Hoover was mentioned. And I was like so honored. When I grew up in Michigan.
He was great in The Versailles Adventure too.
He was fantastic. I have a Shelley Winters story all the time. It's like, so Ernie Borgnine was a huge star when I was a kid. And he made a movie about McHale's Navy, which was a hit TV show. And he came to Flint, Michigan. And for some weird reason, he was appearing in a drive-in theater. And all of us kids wanted to go. And I drove my parents crazy. And we went and we were a mile away in a line of cars. We couldn't even get close to see Ernie Borgnine. So when I finally got to meet him in Hollywood and we became friends and I directed a movie with him, I wrote and directed a movie that he starred in. And then we became partners. Ernie Borgnine, I told him that story and he thought that was the greatest story. And he goes, and you were a kid trying to get into drive-in movie theater just to see me. And now we're in business together making movies. I said, yeah, what a dream. What an amazing story.
It's absolutely amazing.
When I first went to Hollywood, I was just a kid in the Midwest. I worked for CBS. Then I edited the University of Michigan Flint newspaper. And we'd had a lot of financial success and we won a bunch of awards. So I had the summer off. So I went out to Hollywood. Well, I never came back. I mean, I just fell in love with Hollywood. And, I finished up my bachelor's degree in LA at Antioch University. And I got a master's degree in screenwriting and blah, 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 blah. But the first thing I did when I went out to Hollywood is I signed up at the Lee Strasberg Institute. I thought, well, I'll take some acting classes. This is where Lee is the great guru, the actor studio method acting. So I went in and, signed up for, class. And so I hooked up there. And Shelley Winters was a teacher there at the time. So ultimately, I took Lee's master class, which in those days, this would have been in the mid 70s, was like $1,000 to take Lee Strasberg's acting class. But you could audit for $100. And you could sit on the back wall. And on the last class, you got to do a scene, but you could do the exercises and you could read sides with the other students that were in the class. And of course, Marlon Brando, Marilyn Monroe, James Dean, Al Pacino, Robert De Niro all their pictures were on the wall, and they had all been students in this class. So I could only afford to audit the master class. And it was really funny because Sissy Spacek was my scene partner, who was fairly unknown at the time. And so, we sat in folding chairs on the back wall. And so I met Shelley Winters, and she was teaching there. And I ended up being friends with a guy that she was living with and dating at the time named George. He and I had both been a cast in Apocalypse Now, which is the big film that was going to be shooting and everything. And so he said, come and sit in on Shelley's class. So I went to Shelley Winters' class, and she tells a story about some Disney movie, Pete the Dragon or something she's making. And there's these two little kids, and they can't cry. And she's getting anxious, and they're in a boat, and they're on a soundstage on a fake lake. And she says that, this is what you got to do to be an actor. She said, those kids couldn't cry, and I had to pee. So I told them, I leaned over and said, we just got a message. Your parents just died in a car crash. You're orphans. And I told the director to roll, and the kids started crying. And he goes, that's the take we used in the scene. And I was like horrified. This is like, oh my God, this is horrible. This is a terrible thing. So I wasn't a big fan of Shelley Winters. So one day Borgnine calls me up, and he says, I'm kind of down. I said, about what? And he goes, Shelley Winters. Shelley Winters died. We did the Poseidon Adventure. I said, yeah, it's a great movie. And he goes, oh yeah. He said, that was a real physical thing. And he said, did you ever meet Shelley Winters? And I said, yeah, I kind of know her. And I told him the story. And he said, you don't think much of her, do you? I said, I think she's a horrible person. She wrote a memoir, and she told about all the men she slept with. She threw Marilyn Monroe under the bus. She taught a terrible acting class and told people to abuse children. Ernie said, God, I feel great. Thank God she's dead. And he hung up. So part of my job was to keep Ernie Borgnine happy. So,
right.
But
what a story, huh?
Yeah, I got a million of them. I tell you, these people always say, oh, you're a name dropper. Well, these are the people I work with. They're the most interesting people on the face of the earth. And most of the stories I tell are very positive, and they're very terrific stories, and they're great people. And what I've learned, and this, the higher you get on the food chain, the better the people are. Mm-hmm. I've worked with Sylvester Stallone, Talia Shire, Roseanne Cash, people that are just wonderful people. And as you go down the entourage of the people around them, then you start getting into the not so nice people, and so, always
they're still sort of clawing their way up. Yeah.
And trying to pull you down
as they do that. Right.
Right. And they're jealous that you're, whatever. And so Todd, who was sort of managing Bert at the time, was very gracious. But, everybody around him was very protective, the people at the school. If he would not have liked the way we redecorated his school, I would have never gotten an interview. This film would have never existed. If he wouldn't have liked my questions, he would have gotten rid of me. Okay. I mean, it maybe broken my jaw if he could have gotten out of the chair. So, there's a balancing act. And that's why I like you so much, Jim. You've got manners, you got style, and you're sincere. And I always tell people, I taught for 9 years out in Los Angeles. I taught at USC, Loyola. I taught screenwriting, filmmaking, low budget directing. And I always told people, I know it's not fashionable, but if you're polite, and if you keep your car washed, if you're clean, if you show up on time, all these things that you believe in, Jim, and I believe in, eventually great things happen to you. And that's what happened when I got to make an Ernie Borgnine movie. That's what happened when I got to make a Burt Reynolds movie. That's when I got to meet Quentin Tarantino, and he did a great thing for my film, and he was a generous, terrific guy. And so I find, don't act like the bad people. Don't fall prey to all of those sort of bad behaviors that Hollywood is known for. Be a good person, find your values, never back down, and just keep going. And eventually, and it's almost scriptural, it's God's favor. You'll be rewarded. So I've certainly done bad things. I've been a jerk. I've been a bad person, an egomaniac. I've done all that stuff. But in the end, it's like Bert. Bert came out at the end of his life being a follower of Jesus Christ. Bert was at peace with himself. Bert died alone. Bert died reading sides for a movie that he was very excited about being in. And there was no woman in his life. He wasn't dating. He didn't have a girlfriend. And we talk about that. I promised Todd I wouldn't talk about it. But I got caught up in the passion of the moment. And I just wanted to know why the number one sex symbol in the world in my lifetime died alone and didn't have a girlfriend and wasn't dating. And he got to a point where he had been so hurt and so betrayed. And Todd talks about this in the movie, that there were other things that were more important to him. His students, teaching, acting, all of the things that he had the passion about. So my advice to all of your listeners, and I really don't like people that give advice, but I'm going to do it, is follow your personal muse, treat everybody with love and respect and dignity, and you will eventually get where God intends you to be. And I found that in my life. And people that were good to me and encouraged me. You know, when I moved to Hollywood, I this is kind of goofy. I accidentally moved into Sylvester Stallone. And we were in an apartment building off Hollywood Boulevard and Camino Palmero on Hollywood Boulevard. And the second day I was in Hollywood, the manager of the apartment building used to be a stuntman with Errol Flynn. His name was Chuck. And he came up and he goes, "Oh, there's this guy that lives here. His name is Stallone. He just made a little boxing film. Would you like to meet him?" I said, "Yeah, sure."
Stallone.
So I'm sitting at the pool with a guy that I came from Michigan with. We had rented this furnished apartment, and it was an okay place. It wasn't nice, but it was clean. And so this guy comes up and he has black hair parted in the middle, down on his shoulder, greasy, and he drooled out of the left side of his mouth. I mean, he literally had a deformed mouth. He goes, "Oh yeah, I'm Sylvester Stallone. I got a little low budget fight film. You guys want to come see it?" So the second day I'm in Hollywood, I meet Sylvester Stallone. And Sylvester Stallone was an amazing guy. His wife at the time, Sasha, was working at Ralph's and as a checkout girl. And he had the dog Butkus from Rocky, and he had his little son Sage, who was in a playpen. And I used to go over to his apartment, and Stallone would take like 300 vitamins, and do all these shakes and all. I was like, no, I don't think I can do that. But I would go over, and so I started interviewing him about Rocky because I went to see the film, and I thought, "Oh my God, this is a great film." And at the time, the editors took their names off of it. Stu Nahan, who was the sports guy on Channel 4, came out and said, "I'm in this film, and it's terrible, and don't go see it." They weren't even going to release Rocky. Everybody was telling him it was a terrible film. So I went over and I said, "Sly, this is like a masterpiece. This is like a great..." He goes, "No, don't tease me." I said, "Sly, I'm not. I'm telling you, it's a great movie." So I started writing interviews. I was going to school because I'd signed up to take classes in the fall. So I'm studying acting, and we're talking and all this stuff. And Stallone's telling me the whole Rocky story. So I start writing, interviews, and then I'm selling them to magazines and newspaper syndicates because nobody knew who Stallone was. So when Rocky came out, the very first day it opened, we went to a theater. Stallone didn't look like Rocky. He didn't look like, because he let his hair go. And he kept trying to convince him he was the star of the movie, let him in for free, and they wouldn't let him in. He had to buy a ticket. And so we went to the first screening. I think it was in Westwood at like 12 noon. And the movie ended, and people started applauding and stood up and applauded during the credits. It was unbelievable. I told you, it's a great film. But nobody really encouraged him. And even after the film was made, people didn't like the film, and they didn't want to release it. And it was this incredible thing. So I spent 6 months to a year of my life, with Sylvester Stallone, who was extremely gracious, and what a great friend he was. And he introduced me to Talia Shire, and who was Francis Coppola's sister, who had been in not only Adrian and Rocky, which she got an Oscar nomination for Best Actress, but she'd also been in The Godfather playing Marlon Brando's daughter. So then I interviewed her, and then she and I became friends. And then, we started doing things together. And it's like high school. Here's how Hollywood used to work. I don't know what it's like now, but you'd meet somebody and then they'd be in a circle of people and you'd know Stallone. And then through Stallone, you'd meet Talia Shire. And then you might meet her parents, Carmine and Italia, two of the greatest human beings I ever met in my life. You know, her father, Carmine, was this conductor of the Detroit Symphony. And he did the Godfather score and the Apocalypse. And I mean, these people were so talented. But my experience, and for any of your listeners who get the opportunity to cross paths with some of these great people, it makes life so special. And they are so talented and they are so giving and so generous. And I have nothing but great stories about the Coppola family, about Talia Shire. And so, then I was able to work. Stallone's next movie was a movie called Fist. So I kept bugging Stallone, hey, can you get me hired? I want to do something on the film. And the number one thing you never do in Hollywood is say, I'll do anything. It's always better to say, I want to be this. I want to be that. I want to be that. But I didn't know any of that. Nobody told me anything. And there they are, two of the great people that I had in my life. And so Stallone comes in one day and he hands me his speech. He says, call this guy Patrick. So I called him up and I went over to the studio and they hired me on Fist. And I think I was a student observer. And then I ended up being an extra and got to know Norman Jewison, the director. And I got to read lines with Rod Steiger. He was having some problems. He had won an Academy Award for In the Heat of the Night. And this is a guy who did The Pawnbroker. This was one of the great actors. And he was unhappy. And he came over to Norman Jewison. And Norman sat in this high back director's chair. We were on the stage at the old Culver City Studios. And he had a saddlebag with his script. And then everybody else sat on a low director's chairs. And so when I went there the first day, I said, well, can I just sit in any of these chairs? Yeah. So I sat next to Norman Jewison. So we started talking about movies and acting and different things. And I loved the movie he made with Steve McQueen called The Thomas Crown Affair. So we talked about that movie endlessly. So Norman Jewison said, Rick, aren't you studying acting? I said, yeah. Who are you studying with? Well, I'm Lee Strasberg and Stella Adler. And he said to Rod, why don't you have this kid run lines with you? So we went behind the flats. And so he's pacing. And Rod Steiger says to me, did you read the script? I said, yes, sir. Yes, sir. I know the script very well. Well, let's do this scene. Okay. So we start reading the lines. We're doing the lines and everything. And Rod Steiger was kind of a boisterous, hot-headed type person. That was his personality. And I didn't know if he liked it or anything. So he said, all right. So he walks over to Jewison and I go sit in my little director's chair. And he says to Norman Jewison, he says, put this kid in the movie. And I had like long hair and a beard. And this is a period piece, Fist. It's a Jimmy Hoffa story. Sylvester Stallone's in it, all these actors, and Laszlo Kovacs is the DP. And so he says, Jewison says, run to Monty, the makeup guy, and get shaved, get a haircut, get in costume, 10 minutes. If you're back here, you're in the movie. Mm-hmm. So that was how I got cast in Fist. So it was pretty cool.
That's incredible.
And so, yeah, I got to work with Rod Steiger, Academy Award-winning actor. It was pretty awesome.
You worked with Walter Cronkite as well, no?
Yeah, I had a great relationship with Walter Cronkite. When I worked I'll tell you an interesting story. Every good job I've ever had in my life, I said no to. It's just, I don't know what it is. People call me up and they say, oh, let's do a movie on Burt Reynolds. I'm like, let's put Quentin Tarantino on your movie. Yeah. And then I come around and it ends up being the best thing ever. And my wife laughs at me because she says, I'll say no, I'll sleep on, I'll wake up and change my mind, which is George Bernard Shaw's quote, consistency is the mark of a small mind. Mm-hmm. So if you don't process new information, okay. So anyway, I'm in Michigan and I got thrown out of college. I was on a scholarship and I had gotten some sort of thing. My father had left. I hadn't seen him for 7 years. My mother was upset with me for something and she cut off all the thing. And I went back to college for the fall or the winter semester and they threw me out of college. I had no place to live. So I look up my father, who was a postman in Flint, Michigan. I hadn't seen him in 7 years. And he's living with a woman, and they have a house, and there's an attic. But I'm 6'4", and the ceiling in the attic was like 5'6", so you had to crawl around. So I go and I move in this attic, and I'm like, how do I make a living? So I went to see a movie called The Heartbreak Kid with Sybil Shepherd and Charles Grodin, which I loved. Elaine May, unbelievably great movie. And I write an unsolicited film review. And the reason I did this was the job I got, I couldn't get a job. And I tried to get a job in a restaurant. I tried to get a job bagging groceries. And, you know, I'm like this 18-year-old kid, 19-year-old kid. I'm unemployable. I don't have any skills. I want to be in the movies, and I live in Flint, Michigan. It makes no sense. My whole life is crazy. So I saw an ad for a newspaper guy. So I went to work for the Detroit Free Press. And I would go out, and I would, at 3 a.m, a big truck from Detroit would come and throw piles of newspapers on the ground, and they'd have a wire around them. And then you would drive all over and distribute these newspapers into racks where people could buy a newspaper, or you would take them to the house of these paper boys that would deliver the paper. And it actually paid fairly well. For that day, I made about $750 a week. But it was backbreaking work. You had to stay up all night, and you had to work 7 days a week. But I was at least working for the Detroit Free Press. So there's this thing called chutzpah. And if you want to do something in show business, you kind of got to break the rules a little. So I loved the film critic for the Detroit Free Press, Susan Stark. So I called up Susan, and I said, this is Rick Pamplin. I'm with the Free Press. I'd like to have a meeting with you. And she goes, well, what department are you in, Rick? I said, I can't talk to you about that. I just need a meeting. Are you firing me? Well, I don't know. We have to have a meeting. And I talked my way into a meeting with the film critic of the Detroit Free Press. So I do my newspapers all night. I stay up. I get in my car. I drive to Detroit. I put on my little corduroy sport coat, and I walk up, and I go, I'm here for a meeting with Susan Stark. So I go into her office. And she sits down, and we start talking. And I start talking about Clint Eastwood, and why don't you like Clint Eastwood, and why don't you like, and you love Paul Mazursky, but you should like Clint Eastwood. So I start arguing with her about movies, and she goes, "Who the hell are you? Why am I talking?
How'd you get in the building?"
And I go, "I'm a distributor in Flint, Michigan. I have paper boys that work for me, and I fill news racks with the paper." And she goes, "Why did you want to talk to me?" I said, well, you're my favorite movie critic, other than the fact you don't like Clint Eastwood. And I want to learn how to get in the movie business. And she just couldn't stop laughing. And by the way, Susan Stark, one of the great people of all time I've ever met. So she spends an hour giving me every piece of advice she can do on how I can get in the movie business. She said, you should keep the job at the Free Press, but find a weekly newspaper and just start mailing out reviews until somebody hires you. And weekly newspapers were a big thing in those days. So I go home, and I find this newspaper, the Grand Blanc Evening News. I write up a review of The Heartbreak Kid, and I mail it in. And about a week later, somebody says to me, oh, I read your review of The Heartbreak Kid, and they published it. And it was like in the newspaper. And I was like, wow. So I called the editor up. Her name was Kathy. I said, hi, I'm Rick Pamplin. Oh, we loved your movie review. Could you give us some more? She said, how? She said, I said, how many? She said, as many as you can do.
Mm.
So I went out and saw 7 movies. I wrote 7 reviews, and then I wrote these little capsules, Rick's Picks, the best movies, and whatever. And I sent it in, and they published it.
Wow.
So then she called me, and she said, are you going to give us some more movie reviews? And I said, aren't I supposed to get paid for this? And she goes, yeah, you better come to lunch. We better talk. So she takes me to lunch, and I go in, and she says, we're going to start an entertainment section. And the paper came out every like Thursday or Friday. And we're going to have a TV section with movies and TV and the listings and all that like TV guide stuff. And we want to hire you as the editor of it. It's a full-time job. I said, great, but can I still do movie reviews? She said, absolutely. So they hired me, and they made me the movie critic and the arts editor of this Grand Blanc Evening News newspaper. And I'm making a decent little salary. And I think this is it, Jim. I've made it. I'm writing about movies. I'm watching the Dick Cavett show. I'm writing about Marlon Brando and Dick Cavett. This is as good as it gets. And I get to go to Detroit because they do these screenings of the new movies before they open. And I'm like, I'm in heaven. I'm like, this is, how can it get better? So one day she says there's a CBS TV station opening, and it's going to be a mega station, Flint, Saginaw, Bay City, Midland. And it's Russ Kraft Broadcasting. I want you to go up there and do an interview and take some pictures. And I was like, and I put it off for like a couple of weeks. I wasn't interested in TV. I was a movie guy. So finally she says to me, go get this story. So I go up there and I do an interview, and I take a couple copies of the newspaper, and it goes well. And it's a beautiful, beautiful studio. It's in Clio, Michigan. It's beautiful. But I have no interest in television. So I go back. So a couple of days later, I get a call from the programming director. His name is Paul Berry. And I had met him, and he was from Georgia. But what interested me, he had a 914 Porsche. And I'd never been in a Porsche, and I always wanted to drive a Porsche. So he calls me up and he goes, Rick, I've been reading your articles. I read the article you wrote on the station. He goes, you're the most talented guy I've met since I've been here. You've got to come work for us and be on television. I go, I have no interest in television. I have no interest in television whatsoever. He goes, no. What do you, just come have lunch with me. I go, well, it's a long way away from Grand Blanc to Clio. And I said, but you have a Porsche, right? He says, right. If you'll let me drive your Porsche to lunch and back, I'll come have lunch with you. So that was the deal I made. I just wanted to drive a Porsche. I mean, I could care less about the job. So we go to lunch, and he tells me, like, how much are you making? And I go, X number of dollars. He goes, I'll double it. I'll double it, and I'll give you a brand new car to drive. And I'll get you a police scanner. And we'll give you a wardrobe allowance. And we'll take out a life insurance policy. And he gets all this stuff. And the more he offers me, the more I'm not interested. I'm a journalist. I like going to see movies all day. And he says, okay, and you can review movies for CBS. You can actually review movies on the air. Every Friday, we'll do a segment. You can do movie reviews. So I was like, well, I can't really turn this down, can I? So I take this job, and I go in, and I'm too young. And so then they bring in the makeup people, and they dress me in like certain clothes to make me look older. And then I have to say, good evening. This is Rick Pamplin. Here's what's happening on the news tonight. I had to do this sort of Ted Baxter, Walter Cronkite impersonation. So he said, you've got to do an audition. And I said, well, what's that? He said, well, you got to sit down in front of the camera and you got to read a news story. And he said, the news director is not going to let me hire you. I'm going to put you in the news department, but you got to do this thing. So I was like, oh God. And he goes, wear a sport coat. I go, I don't think I have a sport coat. He said, well, just do whatever you can do. So I come up with like a corduroy sport coat, a Michigan guy, and some loud, stupid tie. And I go into the newsroom, and they turn on the lights and they turn on the cameras. And he says, look at the camera with the red light on. And they give me a story. It's about a paragraph. So I read the paragraph and I say, now, here's what's happening in the news tonight. This is Rick Pamplin. And I, for 30 minutes, I don't know why, did a spontaneous newscast. I did news, sports, weather. And at the end, I said, thank you for watching WEYI, Channel 25 Action News. And they turned it off, and they all came running in and said, you're hired, you're hired, you're hired. So that's how I became a newscaster. So this is the longest answer ever you've probably ever heard. But so then my desk in the newsroom was next to the news director, Dick Fabian's office. And he had been a big radio guy in Detroit. And he would be out to meetings and lunches. So the phone would ring. I would go in and answer the phone. Whoever would ring through. So I'd pick it up and it'd go, this is Walter Cronkite. Is Dick Fabian there? I said, no, Mr. Cronkite. This is Rick Pamplin. I'm a beat reporter, but I'm on the air here every day, and I work with Dick. Well, good. I need to talk to you. I'm the general manager of CBS News, and I want to know what's going on in your community. And so we would talk for sometimes up to 45 minutes, and we talk about anything going on, President Nixon, sports, whatever. What are people interested in? What do people care about? And so I developed this phone relationship over the time I worked there with Walter Cronkite. Years later, I'm out in Hollywood. I'm dating an actress. She's on a TV show. And Walter Cronkite's daughter, Kathy, is on the show. So I meet Kathy and I say, "Are you related to Walter Cronkite?" She goes, "That's my dad." I said, "Oh my God, I love your dad. Oh my God, he's been a mentor and a hero of mine," and blah, blah. She goes, "Well, he's going to be here Friday night. He's coming to the taping." I said, "Can I sit? I want to." He's going, "Well, my mom Betsy's coming." I said, "Wow, your mom and your dad." I said, "Could you please introduce me to your father? And can I have a seat next to your father and your mother?" So I sat with Walter Cronkite. We watched the show. And then Walter Cronkite, he's Walter Cronkite. He never breaks character. "Well, Rick, tell me about the business. Like, what's my daughter in for? Do you think she has any talent? What's your?" He's like, he's the same on camera, off camera. He just, was unbelievable. So they invited me and my then girlfriend to go to dinner with him. And I became great friends with Walter Cronkite. And he was very concerned about his daughter, who was a lovely person, being an actress in Hollywood. And he was a very protective father. And it was just the most amazing experience. But while I worked for CBS, I actually did stories that were on the Walter Cronkite CBS News. Richard Nixon, right before he resigned, came to Saginaw, and he did a whole rally to try to prove that the middle America was behind him. And I was part of the CBS crew. I was the leg man for Dan Rather, who was in the White House correspondent. And then I also did a couple stories. There was a newscaster named, it used to be the CBS Morning News with Hughes Rudd. And I did a couple stories for them, one of which Saginaw, Michigan, cut off funding for sports because of budget problems. And then another story happened in Flint. There was a group called the Flint Flying Wheels. It was a motorcycle gang. And they had a big party and they ended up killing a few people. And I got a call at like 3:00 on a Sunday morning and I covered the story. And then I was Monday morning on CBS with that story. And I got to tell you something, Chip, it's really fun. I've been rich and I've been poor. Obviously, rich is better. But, when I was in Michigan and I worked for CBS News, when I did these stories, they would pay us $15 an hour in expenses. I mean, to me, that was the most money. It's like $15 an hour, and we can go to lunch, and we can get the car washed, and we can put gas in the car. Oh my God! And
that's right. $15.
Yeah, no, this was like the mid '70s, and I'm showing people my CBS check, and on my car I had the CBS logo. On my visor, I had a CBS News thing I'd pull down. And then, of course, I had press passes with the sheriff's department and all that. And I just remember it was like, I thought I died and gone to heaven when I was a film critic. Then I thought I died and gone to heaven when I was the arts editor. And then I thought I was like in heaven, working for the news. And after a year and a half, I didn't like them trying to control the content of the news because I felt I was a Walter Cronkite journalist. And they would come in and go, "Well, the price of gold is up. You got to go interview our advertiser in Saginaw." And I went, "No, I don't want to do. Let me go do the story, but I don't want you telling me who I have to interview." So I got in some arguments and disagreements, and they eventually fired me after a year and a half. So I went on unemployment. I became an alcoholic bingo announcer for about a month or two. And I was scheduled to speak at University of Michigan to a journalism class in Flint. So I called up the teacher, the Greg Waters. I said, "You don't want me. They fired me. I'm an alcoholic. My life's over." He goes, "You're like 22 years old. What is wrong with you?" And he said, "Well, it would be more interesting if you will come and tell why you got fired and what TV journalism is really all about." And he said, "You have to go to lunch with me afterwards." So I went and I spoke at this class, University of Michigan, Flint. I told him the truth about how corrupt TV news is, and it's all about advertising. And it pretends to be journalism, but it's not really, unless you're at Walter Cronkite's level. But when I worked for the network, it was much better than local, because local was kind of corrupt. So this guy takes me to lunch. He goes, "I want you to be the editor of the University of Michigan Flint newspaper. You get an office, you get 3 secretaries, you get a full scholarship, you get a salary." I'm like, "No, I don't want that job. No, I don't want that job. I'm going to be a celebrity calling bingo games at Catholic churches and being drunk all day. That's my job now." And he goes, No, you're going to have to go back. You've got to go to college. You've got to get a degree, blah, blah, blah. So again, every job I've been offered, I always turn down. So the next day I wake up and I go, okay, well, let me go look at The Office. So I went over, and the newspaper was pathetic and it was terrible. And, so I said, all right, I'll take it. And I negotiated. And so I got a free, scholarship and all this stuff. And I would go to classes I liked that I would get an A in. And then I would not go to classes that I didn't like science and things like that. And I'd get Fs. So the entire time I was the editor of the University of Michigan Flint newspaper, I carried a strong C average, and I was on academic and citizenship probation because one day I got in a fight with a member of the student government, and I beat him up, and he called the Flint police, and there was snow all around my office, and he was wearing a white sweater, and he was soaked in blood, and they handcuffed me, and then they called the dean, and Dean came out, and the dean said, oh, it's the editor of our paper. Oh, listen, we'll handle this and everything. So I was on citizenship and academic probation the entire time I was here.
As much as we're talking about Burt Reynolds, your life is quite fascinating too. There's some parallels there.
I think I'd seen a lot of Burt movies that kind of impressed me.
Michigan boys.
Yeah. So then what happened was Michael Moore worked for me, the Michael Moore, and he and I won a dozen awards, whatever. It was in the newspapers from the Michigan Media Association, and we won third best paper in the state, and Mike won best columnist. I won third best columnist. So, it was kind of at this point where I had the summer off, and I thought, well, I want to go to Hollywood. I want to go see that's where I really want to be. I want to go to Hollywood. So I went out to Hollywood, and I fell in love, and I met Stallone, and I signed up at Strasbourg, and I wrote a letter to the University of Michigan and resigned my position. And they begged me to, stay another year. And I said, well, I'm on academic and citizenship probation. I'm afraid I can't keep that C average up. So then I moved out. I went back to Michigan. I had a Toyota station wagon. And everything that fit, I took to Hollywood, and everything else I left on my mother's driveway. And I said, give it away, donate it, sell it, do whatever you can do. And I just drove away from my life and started over. And the first week that I was in Hollywood, I had some money because I'd made a lot of money at the newspaper. I went and bought a Fiat because I realized if you're going to date actresses, which is what my goal was, you got to have a hot sports car. So I knew what my priorities, right? So I got a Fiat, and I think I lost like 30 pounds the first summer I was in Hollywood. And then I was like going to the Lee Strasberg, Institute and studying and getting extra work and being cast in movies and TV shows and all of that kind of stuff. And it was just, another dream. So when I was in my early 20s, I'm like, well, this stuff's pretty easy. You just go do it,
Right, exactly.
I didn't have all the heartbreak that would follow and all of the injustices and betrayals and things that happen as you age, as you experience life. But it was a great place. I arrived in Hollywood in the summer of 1976, and it was just a tremendous place. And it was the end. And everybody said to me, oh, you should have been here in the 60s. And people go to Hollywood now, and they tell me, there's nothing there. It's all dissipated. It's all over the country, and there aren't production companies, and the studios, the lots are empty, and now it's a streaming world. It's a whole different, situation. So, you and I are kind of like throwbacks because we love and respect, all of show business and all of the history of it. And I love it. I mean, I used to go to Broadway when I would make money. I would go to New York and see every Broadway show. I mean, I love Broadway. I love theater. I love all of it. And I can't believe I'm 71 years old. I can't believe my life's going to end in 30 years. And I can't believe that it's going to end. I mean, and now, because of the Burt movie, I'm having a resurgence of my career, and it's kind of like, I'm like, boy, I want to soak up every minute of this. So
what would you want on that epitaph? Or is it still a work in progress?
No, I would want to say for rent, he hasn't arrived. I'd like to just keep living and then go directly to heaven. That's what I'd like to do.
We'll be back after this message. I would like that.
Yeah, that's a good one. That's a great one.
So when you look at the amazing things you've done and continue to do. Your career, as much as Burt Reynolds, has been peppered with all kinds of things. When you went, like you said, to Los Angeles and Hollywood, writing and selling movies to Warner Brothers, Walt Disney Pictures, Universal Studios, writing and directing television series, and so much more. And when you look at the work and you say, okay, we did this incredible thing that turned out to be an unbelievable documentary, and the very last interview of this iconic, fascinating, interesting, curious individual in American history and American entertainment, television, film, stage, all of it. Where do you rank this production in the annals of everything that you've done? Is this right at the top? One of the top things that you would say you're most proud of is a shining moment in Rick's career?
Yeah. I'm not a classically trained documentary filmmaker. It was an accidental film. It was driven by passion and my love for Bert. The fact that it's resonated with audiences is the most gratifying thing to me ever. The comments that people have written, the kind reviews that critics have written to call it a cinematic masterpiece or a gem or a classic is unbelievable. What people have said about the film. Yeah, this is it. At 71, I'm peaking. I'm here. This is it. And it's interesting.
You finally made it to the Jim Masters Show series. That's the peaking of all of it to make it here.
there's three things that matter in show business, and everybody knows it. Number one, you get nominated, for an Academy Award. And I've never been in the final 5, but I've been on the ballot 9 times. So I've sort of been there. And I had a film, Hoover, with Borgnine that was in the running. And we opened in theaters, and we really thought Borgnine would get an Oscar nomination. And the Motion Picture Academy has my script in their permanent collection at the Margaret Herrick Library. So that's one thing. The other thing, my favorite restaurant is the Palm Restaurant. And as you know, they put up those caricatures. They're in New York, they're in Los Angeles, they're in Florida. And my caricature of me with a red ball cap is in the Palm Restaurants. And I did an interview once in a magazine, and I said there's 3 things that when you've made it. And I said one of them is the Academy, and one of them is you get your character up at the Palm Restaurant. And the third thing, of course, is when you get invited to be on the Jim Masters Show. It's the third thing. So if you've done those 3 things, you've had a complete life. And I'd like to thank everybody. I'm now going to announce my retirement. No. I plan on living another 30 years. And
minimally, right?
Well,
in a healthy way too.
I read a book that I highly recommend by Kurt Douglas called The Ragman's Son. Kurt Douglas grew up, I think it was in Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, one of these impoverished countries. And his father would collect dirty rags in the street and in garbage dumps and different places. And they would wash. Thank you very much. My lovely wife just handed me a gift she bought me recently, which is the book, Kurt Douglas, The Ragman's Son. It's the greatest book I've ever read in my life. And Kurt Douglas.
We love Maggie. Maggie's fantastic.
Yeah, she is. And so Kurt Douglas wrote this book about, as a child, he was going to grow up and be a guy who spent his days in garbage bins collecting dirty rags, cleaning them, and then selling them on a cart in the street. And he dreamed of going to Hollywood. So he went to Hollywood. He became the #1 box office star in the 50s. He became a multimillionaire, and he was walking down Rodeo Drive smoking a cigarette. And he said, whoa, these cigarettes are going to kill me. And he took his Zippo lighter and his pack of cigarettes, and he went up to a little garbage receptacle, and he threw it away. And he said, I realized I had achieved what I wanted to achieve in my life, but I wanted it to last as long as possible. And he became like a health nut and a super successful guy. Kurt had a stroke. He wrote a book about it, continued to work up until he was 100. And I believe he died at 105. So he's always been an inspiration to me. And by the way, if you go on YouTube, there's these channels of actors that live to be 100. You'd be shocked.
It's amazing.
Proportionally to the population.
Well, look at Dick Van Dyke. God bless him.
He's going to make 100 and keep going. I know. Dick's great.
Dick Van Dyke.
But when I was a teenager, Jim.
Did you ever work with him or meet him? Dick Van Dyke?
No. You know what? I love Dick. I've never met him. I love the guy. But when I was a teenager, I was very ill. I was in the hospital a lot. And they didn't think I'd live to be 20. And so I read literature. I read all the great classics, Gatsby and Salinger and, the Dostoevsky and, all of the Middle English and, Chaucer, Blake. And I think that's part of what, led me to be a storyteller. And so I would develop, interest in these stories. But I remember this, and I can't remember the exact book. I think it was the Brothers of Ivan Ilyich or whatever. But one of the Dostoevsky books. Dostoevsky said there's 3 things in life that you have to be happy. Number 1, you have to have a relationship with God. Number 2, you have to be in love. Number 3, you must do creative work. Human beings were invented and created to be happy and in love and in relationship with God and do creative work. And I believe that's why this sickly little overweight kid from Flint, Michigan in a hospital bed who dreamed of going to Hollywood, who every teacher and every guidance counselor said, no, that's not for you. You're not. People like you don't make movies. I heard this my whole life. I got virtually no encouragement in Michigan. But I felt I had that burning desire to become who I became and also to live past 20. And, I was in an oxygen tent, and then I got a staph infection. And if I touched a comic book, they had to burn it. And I mean, it was very horrifying as a child. I was born with some physical defects. I'm 71 years old. I have no disease. I'm on no prescription drugs. And I just directed a feature film for 3 weeks with 110 actors. I believe that God's favor and my desire and my drive is what brought me here. And I wish that for every one of your listeners.
It's amazing. It really, really is. What a touching story, too. Yours and, of course, Bert's as well, and sharing it. Thanks for being so open and sharing that, Rick. We also, before we go, we do have the trailer, which we would love to show everybody.
Sure.
Where can they see this if they want to check it out? And now that they're, chomping at the bit to see it, where can they see Burt Reynolds' The Last Interview?
The easiest way is to go to moviemoney.com.
See it right there on the screen, folks.
Right, moviemoney.com. And that'll have all of the streaming sites, and you just click through to them. And if you're broke, you don't have a lot of money, and you don't want to pay for it, that's fine. You can go to Tubi and see it. You can go to the library channels, which are Canopy. And what's the other one, Maggie? Hoopla. These are great, great things where the library puts up movies. We're very honored that our films are included in these collections. Or if you want to go to Amazon or other places, you can buy it, you can rent it. But definitely you can see the film. It's all over the world. Go to moviemoney.com, and I'd be honored if you'd show the trailer.
And here's the trailer. Burt Reynolds, The Last Interview.
I made over 80 pictures. This is a lot. I think it's a great business to be in because you're giving. It's a wonderful thing to do.
I think Burt Reynolds' legacy will be one of the most charming movie stars in the history of Hollywood.
So they threw me through the window and they gave me $200 or something. I said, what a terrific way to make a living.
I don't teach acting. I teach behavior.
He loved his students. He would teach all night long.
As a waiter at the Burt Reynolds dinner theater, they were really magical times. John Travolta visited, Sylvester Stallone came in, I waited on Dolly Parton, Carol Burnett.
I don't think he really ever got over losing the original dinner theater and that school.
He was fabulous as a human being, better than he was as an actor.
It was exciting for me to finally cast Burt Reynolds in a movie. The fact that I made him happy, that makes me like forever grateful.
What do you think of the movies today?
Not much. This is a bad-ass place. How many people do you know will jump in the middle of a fight in 2 seconds? I like guys like that. I like women like that.
Truthfully, I would have no problem going out like Burt Reynolds, being excited about something, being able to experience a bit of it, and then kicking off out of the blue. That sounds like the way to go, man.
Wow. Very powerful, very riveting. And you just to see him and hear him, it's really extraordinary. I would imagine it was emotional for everybody too, especially when obviously he passed. But when you realized in going back and looking at the footage and putting it together, not really realizing that this was going to be a situation where it was a finality to it.
I get emotional watching the trailer right now. I mean, I love the guy. I love all the happiness and the art and the goodwill. And that I got to know that guy at the end of his life, that I got to be able to make a movie about him.
Did he know what you felt about him all those years?
Oh, yeah.
Did you get to tell him?
Oh yeah. We at the end of the thing, we told each other we loved each other. I mean, it was unbelievable. It was interesting. I got a call. I've gotten hundreds of calls, but I got a call from Pastor Patrick Moody, who did Bert's funeral. And I didn't go to his funeral. I wasn't invited. And I just figured maybe it was family, friends. It was a media circus. I just didn't, So I stayed away. So I got a call from Pastor Patrick Moody. And he said, I really want to go to lunch with you or dinner. I want to take you and your wife to dinner and thank you for the film and talk about Bert. And I was like, I kind of kept saying no, like I do to everything. And then finally we went to a steakhouse and he brought another pastor from Orlando who came down with his wife. So the 6 of us went to dinner for 3 hours and he told the most amazing stories about Bert and how much the movie meant to the people that loved Bert. And he officiated at Bert's funeral. And he told stories. His father was the evangelist, Jess Moody, and he married Bert and Lonnie. And Patrick grew up with Bert being part of his family. And he was so impressed with the movie. And he just wanted to thank me and, meet me and tell me stories about Bert. And he told a great story I'll share with you real quick. When his father and Bert went fishing one day, and Jess Moody, they got out in the ocean, and Pastor Moody said to Bert, you've got to come to Jesus. You've got all this celebrity and this fame and this influence and this money. You have got to come to Jesus Christ. Bert said, I'm not ready. And so about an hour later, he brought it up, and Bert said, don't bring it up again. It makes me uncomfortable. I'm not ready. So the boat started coming in. So it came into the port of Los Angeles past Peanut Island. And they're coming in to the loading area. The boat's going to dock. And Pastor Moody, Jess Moody, says to Bert one more time, we got to talk about Jesus. And Bert said, if you don't knock it off, I'm jumping out of this boat. And Pastor Moody continued, and Bert jumped out of the boat. That's how much he wouldn't talk about Jesus. And Pastor Moody told me the story on his 82nd birthday, how all of Bert's friends and family and everybody were together. And he said, I'm ready to accept Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior. And this was shortly before we did the interview. And the only time he ever wore the gold cross was in my interview. And if you look really closely, there's a little gold cross on his sweater. And I think that Bert went through a spiritual conversion. And I think Bert knew he was dying when we did the interview. And I think that's why he decided that maybe I was the guy to talk to express things, to be himself, and to get whatever was on his mind or on his chest to get it off. And I think that's what happened. I think God put me there at the right moment, and Bert was there at the right moment. I had no idea. I was not prepared. I didn't have any notes. I didn't know any of this. And what came out of it was so authentic. And by the way, it's so rare. I don't know any other movie star that would sit and submit themselves to this or participate in something like this, because they're so managed and controlled now by agents and managers and publicists and all this stuff. And it just was so rare. So my thing was to be true to Bert. Don't edit Bert. Don't cut Bert. Don't take 1 second away from Bert, and then wrap it around to tell his story. And that's what we did. And then wonderful people like you have come forward and said, hey, I want to talk to you about this, and let me help you promote the movie. And I appreciate you and bless your show and all of these people. And I think as you get older, and you're still young, Regis, but as you get older, Jim, you realize there's a lot more to life than we realize. And you're going to have to come to grips sooner or later with your relationship with God. And when we die, 80% of the people in the world believe we're going to be face to face with God. 80% of the people in the world believe this. I believe it. So I'm trying to live my life in a way that God would appreciate what I'm doing. And I'm trying to be a good person. And I'm trying to be forgiven for my sins. And I'm trying to atone for those. And Bert talks to me. I dream about Bert. I get in a situation where I'm not sure about something. I talk to Bert. We have a dialogue. He's in my head. And I know what Bert would say. And when I was fighting with everybody on editing the film, Bert says in my movie, make your film and don't listen to anybody. Mm. He says it on camera. So I said, I'm working for Burt Reynolds. I'm not working.
Follow your heart and do it. Yeah.
So I stood up to everybody, and people were mad at me and appalled, and 100 of his friends are mad I didn't put him in the movie. But I think I got the right people, and I think I did the right thing with the interview. And I watch movies every day. I don't see movies where a movie star sits with 3 cameras and is not interrupted and is not cut for an hour and a half and gets to say what's on their mind. And this guy's a living legend, and now he's no longer living, but he will live as a legend forever. You know, if you go on streaming, everyone, I checked this like 6 months ago. Every Burt Reynolds movie that was ever made, including the first one, which is horrible, is still in distribution. People all over the world are still watching. I talked to this guy in Sweden, and he goes, they still show Burt Reynolds movie on cable at 8 o'clock Saturday night. Burt Reynolds is still a huge star. It's like he's still alive. And I've gone back, and I think I've seen every Burt Reynolds film. There's 80 of them. And some of them, like Starting Over, they're just these wonderful gems. Sharky's Machine. I mean, some of these films are like, they're so good. Okay, they've held up, and they're so entertaining. And so my wife and I, what's the first movie you made, that Injun Joe movie?
Oh my gosh.
Quentin Tarantino and I got in an argument about it.
He loves it.
Bert played an Indian, and the movie doesn't make any sense. It's crazy. What's it called? I don't know. It was Injun Joe or some crazy thing. And Bert plays this Indian, and the movie makes no sense. And then Bert had to go back to shoot Dan August. And so they didn't know how to end the movie, so they just blew up everything and killed everybody. It's the stupidest movie. And Quentin thinks it's a masterpiece. And Quentin and I were arguing about this. But Burt Reynolds' very first movie, which is horrible, Bert said, I look like Natalie Wood in a wig. He goes, I look like Natalie Wood in a bad wig. He goes, it's a terrible movie. And so, but anyway, it's one of Quentin's favorite movies. But all of these Burt movies all over the world are still playing. And Bert was a guy who loved life. He loved people, and he loved show business. And, I think it comes through, even though he did a lot of dramatic films, he did a lot of serious stuff. And he did a lot of lighthearted and fun stuff. But he's in my head. And a lot of people have said this to me. A lot of people said, I've watched the movie and now I think about Bert all the time. Things that he said. So I think Bert, I resisted this for a long time. I think Bert knew he was going. I think Bert knew that he didn't have much time. And I think as the interview developed, I think he realized this kid's probably not going to cut me up. He's probably not going to sandbag me. He's not going to bring up tabloid nonsense. He said, maybe this is my chance. Maybe I should just talk about what I want to talk about.
To be me and tell my story. And exactly. And I think the movie you're talking about is Navajo Joe.
That's it. Navajo Joe. That's it. Yeah.
We move quick around here at the Jim Masters Show.
I'm very impressed. Very impressed.
And the other one we want to show that you mentioned too with Ernest Borgnine, of course, Hoover.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a great experience with Borgnine comes back from the dead to play J. Edgar Hoover and to take on his critics. So that was a pretty interesting stuff.
Ernest Borgnine, Burt Reynolds, Walter Cronkite. He's seen and worked and been touched by the lives of them all, my folks. His name is Rick Pamplin, and he's joining us from Florida. Rick, this was an extraordinary conversation, truly, celebrating, of course, the incomparable Burt Reynolds and this documentary, which is, if anybody's a Burt Reynolds fan, or they just love Hollywood icons, or they just like stories about people in a raw, authentic, real, unedited, uncensored, uncut way. You get so much about Burt that you've never really seen before or appreciated before in the last interview. And this gentleman here, responsible with Quentin and everybody else for making it happen. And again, you can go to moviemoney.com, check it all out. It is something that everybody's been talking about, and they continue to. And this guy's been making movies and television and all of it for a long time. Michigan boy, did good, Hollywood, but now he's in Florida with his feet in the sand, doing what he wants to do with Maggie by his side. Really fantastic conversation, Rick. We'll keep the porch light on for you, and I truly hope you enjoyed the time with us and me as much as I absolutely have with you. So,
yes, I did, Jim. It's an honor to meet you, to be on your show, and I want to wish God's favor and blessings for you and everyone listening.
I thank you very, very much. And don't forget to put that in writing and address it management.
I'll do.
My dad's line. Of course, spread the word about our show. Thanks for your generosity of time as well, my friend. We had an amazing conversation. And it was also a real delight learning more about you, too, and what drives you and the Rick story as well. So thanks for sharing that and being so authentic in that way, too. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
You be well. No, go get a sandwich. You've earned it. You be well. Thanks, Rick, and thank Maggie for us as well.
I will. Thank you.
You be well. Take care now. Incredible screenwriter, motion picture director, and all-around great guy, Rick Pamplin, joining us here from Florida, USA, by way of Michigan, and of course Hollywood, as we've celebrated the incomparable Burt Reynolds. He got a chance to really celebrate him in a way that most of us didn't get a chance to do, because he had that incredible affinity and appreciation for Burt Reynolds over the years. Finally got a chance to be placed in the same room with him on a couple of occasions, and then had that amazing, in-depth, unedited, riveting, emotional, moving interview with him, the last interview. Rick himself has an epic career as again, motion picture director, screenwriter, and so much more, and all the other things he does. But he had those moments which turned out to be the very last interview ever with the incomparable star of screen, stage, television, and more, the one and only Burt Reynolds. Again, an icon in American entertainment. He just really touched our lives in so many different ways. He had a real charisma about him. There was just something about him that really stood out. And again, if you ever get a chance to see the the Johnny Carson moments with the Tonight Show with Burt Reynolds. What the two did with a can of whipped cream, I won't even tell you. You got to check it out. Truly an icon. And of course, all the Smokey and the Bandit movies, but he just was really somebody special and directed so much as well. So much great material. So we really thank him for being with us, Rick, superstar. And we hope you enjoyed this wonderful look at the life of Burt Reynolds in our way here at the Jim Masters Show, and then giving you a little bit of a teaser there about the last interview. Rick, Pamplin, Quentin Tarantino, and the gang put it all together. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, a little homework for you before you head out. We would absolutely love it if you give this episode a thumbs up like. Be sure and give this episode a thumbs up like. Share this episode on your social media. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Which is Jim Masters TV. And drop a comment below. We love interacting with our viewers watching from all around the world. We hear from you. We love having you here. And check out hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of past episodes with celebrity friends and guests who stop by the Jim Masters Show, Entertainment Lifestyle Celebrity Talk Show series, to have some fun with us. A lot of times, poignant moments. Sometimes they're singing. Sometimes they're making us laugh. Sometimes they're getting deep about their lives, their experiences. We love it all. And that's what we do here. There's something for everybody at JMS, the Jim Masters Show. Don't forget to love one another. We always say that. Take care of one another. And don't forget to do the very same for yourself. Come back and see us again. We'll keep the porch light on for you and you and you and you right here at JMS and Liberty Hall at the Jim Masters Show. You be well. Thanks for being with us. Spread the word about our show. We love when you're doing that. And come see us again. Be well, everybody. And cheers.